Okay, can you hear me and see me?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Yes, thank you for the introduction. And Rachel, thank you for that great talk. It's always good to see all of the different benefits of. Um, I'm going to focus in specifically on the benefits for birds and also the benefits for farmers through pest control provided by birds. So I'm really going to dig into the weeds, no pun intended, on some of the ecology of the birds that we're seeing out there. Here we go. So it's undeniable that agriculture has a really big impact on birds. And for all of the globally threatened bird species across the planet, agricultural expansion and intensification by far is the leading cause of the leading threat for birds, just in terms of the amount of habitat that's been taken, the amount of pesticides that are damaging to birds that have been applied to these landscapes. So undeniably, it's a rough go for birds in terms of the overall landscape effects of agriculture. However, through time, despite the fact that we've lost a lot of these habitats, birds also occupy farmlands in the billions. And so really what we're trying to shift to here recently is exactly why we're doing this talk today is what can we do to these on these agricultural lands to make them beneficial for birds so we can reduce some of those declines and also maybe harness some of their beneficial pest control services at the same time. Just trying to get my window set up over here. Okay, so and one way we can do that potentially is to add these local biodiversity enhancements and hedgerows as an example. So here's just 4 different crops with different types of hedgerows on the edges. Rachel and Emily have both demonstrated some of the great benefits of hedgerows. But it's important to think about kind of how birds look at the landscape and how they might respond to some of the habitat that we work that we do on these farms. So there's something called the Johnson's 4 levels of habitat selection. And this is something that birds employ, all animals employ, but we'll do it from the perspective of birds. So the first scale is sort of the geographical range of a species. So birds are going to select habitats on a really huge scale. This is like continental global scales, right? So here's a picture of yellow-rumped warblers breeding range. The blue is where they spend time in the winter. The orange is where they spend time on migration. And the red is where they spend time during the breeding season. So the birds that we're attracting to our farms, each of them has a completely different map. And we need to think about sort of what species are here, why they're choosing it, and also when they're choosing it. The second level of habitat selection from birds is a sort of home range or an individual or social group level, which is right here on the top right. And so this is like their territory during the breeding season. Even some birds hold territories during the winter. And so each of these circles represents an individual bird that selected a territory with its pair, and it's foraging within that, it's breeding within that. And so in an agricultural landscape like this, where you have orchards next to a breeding or a river, some natural habitat, there's birds that are going to be selecting mostly that hedgerow, and there's some birds that are going to mostly be selecting the edge of the crop and that sort of thing. So this is another level that birds investigate when they're trying to select where they spend time. The third are the habitat components within those individual social groups or territories. So this is something like the size of a hedgerow or the edge of an orchard, whether it's a grassy field, that sort of thing. And then the fourth level is even finer scale, which is the resources within that habitat that they select. So this might be anything from the where birds forage, what kind of diet they eat. For example, do they choose trees that have smooth bark like this or really jagged bark like this? Do they eat seeds? Do they eat moths that fly in the air? Do they eat cocoons that hang out on bark under trees? Do they eat larvae? Each species will have kind of a different characteristic in this way. And so these are sort of all the different scales we need to investigate or think about when we're thinking about birds using farms and benefits from birds. So that's how I'm going to structure my talk. The first question I want to ask is, do habitats on the farms like hedgerows provide habitat for birds? And Rachel's already really given a lot of examples of how it does, and I'm going to give a few more. Why do we want birds on our farms? Well, because we love them. They're beautiful. We want to help them. We want to reverse their declines. Everybody enjoys birds. Farmers enjoy birds, business people enjoy birds. Almost everybody I know enjoys birds, but they're especially beneficial for growers and for humans because they provide us a lot of services, including seed dispersal and pollination. But for farmers in particular, we really benefit from the insectivory or their insect eating capabilities, and also their rodent control, such as this barn owl. And each of these crops across the globe is a different study where somebody has demonstrated that birds reduce pests in these various crops, sometimes reducing crop damage, sometimes even increasing yield. So these are all examples where reduced crop pests to benefit farmers. So the second question is, we know that birds will reduce pests, but does having something like a hedgerow improve that surface? So do hedgerows improve pest reduction by birds in the adjacent crops? Thirdly, the crops themselves are really different, right? So we have row crops, we have orchards, we have young orchards, like this smooth bark of a young orchard, really ragged orchard bark. So the type of crop we have, the season that the crop is growing, the phenology of the crop, all those things are also going to determine what birds are using our lands. So my third question is, how important are the crop characteristics? And then finally, birds are also paying attention to the landscape at a much greater scale, right? They fly. A bird's eye view is a good term for a reason. So I'm really curious about how what we do on farms, individual farmers do on their own land, interacts with what's going in the larger landscape. So for example, on the left here, farmland in Yolo County with cash. So there's a lot of diversity and heterogeneity, we call it, in the environment. And on the right here, we have a really simplified landscape with very few hedgerows, maybe a tiny little ditch, that sort of thing. These two landscapes look really different to birds. And a farm that's in the middle of the landscape on the right might respond really differently than a farm in the landscape on the left. So my last question, or last thing I want to talk about today, is how important is the surrounding landscape? And so to answer the first question, I worked with some colleagues from Nature Conservancy and Audubon, and we asked kind of how do these hedgerows in the landscape influence birds, and are there differences in the characteristics of the hedgerows themselves that might attract birds more than others? So we worked in Yolo and Solano counties. We chose over 111 farm edges. 49 of them were clean, like this one up here on the left. Some of them just had simple tree lines. Some had actually planted hedgerows, and some was either remnant riparian habitat or replanted riparian habitat. And we found that overall, riparian habitat, hedgerows, tree lines all had more bird species than these clean edges on the left, and that this happened in both years of the study. So by far, whether you had even a simple tree line or a hedgerow or a riparian habitat, were all more beneficial in terms of the amount of species of birds that you attract than a clean edge. And most important, interestingly, even in this 1 year, something like a hedgerow was even as beneficial as like a wider, more robust riparian area. Okay, so do habitat on farms like hedgerows? Yes, they absolutely do. So what about the orchard characteristics, or the characteristics of the farm next to the hedgerows? This is like pretty complicated. The main thing to point out is that the white bar means there's a row crop adjacent to that hedgerow, and the gray bar means there are both orchards on either side of the hedgerow. And this is just to show that even in something like a hedgerow or a riparian hedgerow or a tree line or even a bare weedy area, it really does depend on what you have on the edge of the crop, whether it's an orchard or a row crop, in terms of the total number of birds you're going to attract to your hedgerow. So how important are the crop characteristics? Super important. Okay, so finally, how important is the landscape? This is my favorite topic. So how do these small scale hedgerow farm edges interact with that wider landscape scale in terms of influencing birds in the hedgerows themselves? And all you have to pay attention to here is on the y-axis, we have the number of bird species in a hedgerow. And on the right here, we have the distance of that hedgerow to the nearest natural woodland. And so what we see is that riparian areas have the most bird species, hedgerows have the next, then tree lines, then at the lowest here is bare and weedy. But if you're very close to another patch of woodland, you have the most bird species in a hedgerow. And if you're very far away from a patch of woodland, you're also having more species in a hedgerow. And there's kind of this little area in between where bird species richness in hedgerows are lower. And this might be where in a landscape where you want to target putting in a hedgerow. That makes sense. So what birds use your hedgerow is going to depend on what the surrounding landscape looks like as well. So how important is the surrounding landscape? Super important. Okay, so let's move on. How do hedgerows influence pest reduction by birds in adjacent crops? this is going to employ something that we call conservation biological control. So over here on the right, this is a system where a lot of this work has taken place in coffee systems in Jamaica, Africa, Mexico. And here we have on the bottom coffee berries. We have the coffee berry borer beetle in the middle, and those impact the coffee berries by eating them and causing damage to yield and crop damage. And then we have these, as an example, black-throated blue warblers, which eat the coffee berry borer beetle, therefore reducing damage in the coffee. So you have this overall positive effect of the birds on the coffee, if that makes sense. So what we're asking with the hedgerows and with habitat in the natural landscape is, if we plant hedgerows, or if we have more habitat in the natural landscape, or if there's something to do with a crop that we're working with, can we actually make this relationship, this top-down positive relationship from birds on the crops, stronger by having more habitat, because we'll have more birds? So I was interested in looking in this system in the Sacramento Valley. And I worked with Rachel, who you have met. She's here being very casual on a tractor. So we decided to focus in on English walnuts for a couple reasons. One, where I was in California, I was at UC Davis doing my dissertation. So the US produces 12% of the world's walnuts, and 99% of those are grown in California and in the Central Valley. So really important crop for California. Also, they take up a lot of land. So, and this has really increased over the last 15 years. So over the last 15 years, we've seen the thousands of acres of increases in walnuts, and we've seen the orchards themselves become much more dense. So really important element of the landscape, especially in California. We also know that one of the key pests are these codling moths, which when uncontrolled can cause up to 40% damage in these walnuts, and it can be quite expensive for growers and for all of us, really, even as consumers. So there are a couple different stages that the codling moth goes through. They'll start here as an adult in the spring, they'll fly, then they'll lay eggs. The little larvae will hatch from the eggs, they'll bore into the walnuts, rendering them unmarketable. So they've damaged the walnut at that point. And then the larva will leave in the fall and the winter. They'll build little cocoons underneath the bark flakes on the walnut trees themselves, and then, or on the ground underneath the walnut trees, and then they'll hatch the next spring to become a new adult. So I really wanted to focus in here on this wintering time period when the larvae don't move around, they're in cocoons, they're really susceptible to things like predation from birds. So the idea here is if birds are able to reduce codling moth during the winter, there won't be as many adults flying in the spring. And the reason I selected that time period also is because there's already been a ton of research since the 50s demonstrating that birds reduce these codling moths in apple orchards, sometimes up to 97%. So I already knew that. So it kind of set the stage for me to ask, A, does this also happen in walnuts? And B, is there something we can do with the habitat on the farm to even make this a better service or a bigger impact on the part of birds? So I selected 20 orchards, and 10 of them were what we called habitat orchards. So these had either riparian areas or hedgerows on their edges, and 10 of them were clean. So they had no hedgerows at all and were either bare or weedy margins. And I also described the habitat in the surrounding landscape, basically the percentage of semi-natural habitat in the landscape. Each one of these circles demonstrates a particular hedgerow, and I used GIS to categorize how much natural habitat was in the surrounding landscape. So I asked one of the first questions I want to ask before jumping into this predation question is just like, are birds using these hedgerows and these orchards in the same ways that we showed in the other study? So I did some bird surveys, I put out some video cameras, and yes, we found a lot of birds using these orchards during the winter. And I wanted to focus in specifically on the bird species that had the foraging characteristics and the habitat choices that would specifically mean that they would eat codling moths, if that makes sense. So all of these different species, there's 10 of them, are woodpeckers and nuthatches. And these are all birds that forage on tree trunks, that eat larvae, and that would specifically be targeting codling moth. And that's really important, because if I just counted birds that don't actually eat codling moth, we wouldn't really see that much, or that wouldn't really tell us much, right? And so for these 12 different species, we see some interesting things. This is a heat map. So anything that's dark red or orange are places where birds have, that particular species is most abundant. And each one of these little numbers is an individual hedgerow or inside an orchard. So for example, on one here, we have 4 species in hedgerow 1 on the margin transect. And then I also did a transect inside the orchard itself at that same orchard. And there was only 1 species. So overall, what this is saying is that there are more species in the hedgerows themselves than in the orchards adjacent to the hedgerows. In the orchards adjacent to the hedgerows, there are maybe 3 or 4 woodpecker species, but still quite a few. So that's kind of neat. But the hedgerows themselves really had quite a diversity of species. And is there a difference between whether you have a hedgerow or not? Yes, totally. So the green here are the orchards that had the hedgerows, and then these tiny little orange dots are the orchards that had no hedgerows at all, barely any birds using those at all. And inside the orchard, we see a similar pattern, not quite as strong. So 100 meters away from the hedgerow into the walnut orchard, we still had more bird species when there was a hedgerow on that orchard's edge than orchards that had no hedgerow at all. But the relationships or the difference is a little bit muted. They're also paying attention to what's going on into the orchard, and they're less influenced by the hedgerow themselves. Okay, so I can't actually see my clock. So how am I doing on time? Okay. Okay, great.
So you have, you have about 10 more minutes. So for the whole thing. So just leave 5 minutes or so for questions.
All right, I'll jam through this as quickly as I can. All right, so I also looked at a couple different habitat features on these farms and looked at the maximum number of woodpecker abundance, because I found that woodpeckers were actually some of the primary foragers on these codling moths in the orchard. So on the top here, we just have whether the orchard trees themselves, what they looked like. Were they tall or short? Did they have a lot of bark or not? So we just found that there were more woodpeckers in the orchards when the trees were tall, the walnut trees were taller, when they were bigger, and then they had deeper fissures in the bark, or basically if they were an older orchard. Second, there were more woodpeckers in the orchard if there was more cover in the natural landscape surrounding the farm. And then finally, the characteristics of the hedgerow itself was important. So there were more woodpeckers in orchards when there was a hedgerow on the edge that was taller, that had more layers, and that was wider. It's basically the better. So does habitat on farms like hedgerows provide habitat for birds? Absolutely. How important are the crop characteristics? Totally important. And 3, how important is the surrounding landscape? Super duper important. So how do these same questions, how can we answer these same questions when we're just looking at pest predation by birds? So to answer this question, I procured 2,000 codling moth larvae from the Agricultural Institute Research Station in Parlier, California. And the really generous farmers who trusted me dearly apparently let me glue these live codling moths to their trees. So in these same 20 orchards, I glued 100 codling moths on the trees of each orchard, cages, which would keep birds from being able to eat those larvae. And on half of them, I left them open. So in other words, I was able to compare the predation rates between the larva to which birds had access and the larva to which birds were not able to have access because of these cages. And so I looked at these throughout the winter. I also looked at a couple. So the main questions I had were, what was the influence of the cage? What was the influence of whether it had would predation be different if there was a hedgerow or not a hedgerow? Would predation be different if the larvae were on the orchard edge versus inside the orchard further away from the hedgerow? Would they be influenced by the amount of semi-natural cover in the landscape? And then there was another factor I used that sort of determined whether birds ate a bunch of larvae on the same tree or not, which we don't have to get into. So first question, cages made a big difference. So when birds had access to those larvae, they predated larvae up to as high as 75%, whereas the caged larvae showed very small amount of predation, and those were mainly like lacewings and spiders and those sorts of things. So birds had a huge impact on the predation of these codling moth larvae. And here's just, I'm going to go really quickly and show you our 2 favorite species. This is a Nuttall's woodpecker on the left, foraging one of our codling moth. And here is a white-breasted nuthatch on the right, also foraging on these codling moth that I put out. The one on the left is going to get one, I promise. Oh, you can see it. You just saw the white-breasted nuthatch just snacked on a little codling moth larvae. Oh, there it goes. I love these guys. I could watch this all day long. Okay, so then we looked at the surrounding landscape and we found a couple things. One, simply having a hedgerow on the edge of your orchard actually wasn't very effective at increasing predation. That was something we were surprised with. What was more important was the amount of natural landscape or semi-natural habitat in the surrounding landscape. So here in the green, we have the larva to which the birds had access. In the orange, we have the caged larva. And this just shows that for those larvae to which the birds had access, the more natural habitat you had in the landscape, including hedgerows, the more predation you saw. So do habitats on farms like hedgerows improve pest control by birds and adjacent crops? Sort of. I mean, they increase the number of birds, but maybe not directly predation. How important is the surrounding landscape? Super duper important. Okay, then I also looked at just the larvae that were uncaged. So just the larvae to which birds had access. I asked all those same questions. I also asked a couple other things like, do things like how the walnut tree, what are the characteristics of the walnut trees, and does that influence predation? And sure enough, it really did. It had a strong effect. So this is predation on the left, and larvae were more predated on walnut trees that were taller, had a larger DBH or were wider, and that had deeper fissures. So for example, this is smooth bark on the left and really rough bark on the right, and there was much more predation in these older walnut orchards. So do habitats on farms like hedgerows improve pest reduction by birds and adjacent crops? Sort of. How important are the crop characteristics? Super duper important. Okay, and how important is landscape? Also very, very important. So in short, more local and landscape habitat equals more avian predators. More predators equals more predation of codling moth larvae, especially in those cleared landscapes. I didn't get into that. More landscape habitat means you have more avian predators and more predation of the codling moth. And the bigger, older trees you have on your farm means you're going to have more predation, more predators, especially in landscapes that maybe are more simplified. All right. I had to rush through those last couple slides, but I'm open for questions if we have time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sasha. That was really, really great. We do have about 5 minutes for questions. I don't see any in the, no, just a comment. Amazing talk and research. Thank you. If anybody has any questions though, please feel free to put them in the comment box. You might want to check
okay.
The comment box too, or chat box.
If I got anything directly.
Yeah.
Sacha, I have a question. Have you, or do you know of any growers that put up nest boxes, say, for the white-breasted nuthatch?
That's a good question. I actually don't know anybody that's put out boxes for white-breasted nuthatches, and that's a really good idea because yes, they are cavity nesters, as are Nuttall's woodpeckers. I actually don't know how successful either of those species are. Or how much they occupy boxes. I don't think Nuttall's woodpeckers will use boxes actually, but have you seen anything about white-breasted nuthatches?
Well, I think one of our earlier speakers, Melanie Truen, who has 200 nest boxes along the Poudre Creek corridor, has some number of them occupied by white-breasted nuthatches. And I bet you some of those may be near walnut orchards because she's right in this area where you studied. So
yeah, she was right along Poudre Creek where I had several orchards. Yeah, so I think one of the differences between something like a bluebird, which really occupy boxes and are really helpful for vineyards and that sort of thing, is white-breasted nuthatches tend to be not as, they don't flock, right? So they hang out mostly in like little groups or with other foraging flocks. And so I think they're less abundant. So they might not, if you put out 100 boxes, you won't get like 100 white-breasted nuthatches. But if you put out bluebird boxes, which is the same size as the nuthatch, you're going to get a couple of nuthatches, and those are going to be super beneficial. I mean, we had like in some orchards, very few nuthatches, like 1 or 2 even, and they just snacked. Like they removed all of the codling moths, and I got videos of them. I could see their little like tiny needle piercings into it. And Rachel and you both just showed videos showing natural or not, white-breasted nuthatches foraging up and down the tree, looking in all the bark crevices. That's exactly what they're doing to look for those codling moths. So we got to give mad respect to those white-breasted nuthatches for sure. Yeah, it's a good point. I want to look more into that actually, sort of what can we do artificially to attract nuthatches. But what we do know is that they're attracted to oaks and larger, older trees. So if you make sure that one of the points I was trying to make with looking at both the crop and the surrounding landscape and the hedgerow is, let's say you have an orchard, you're going to want to bring in birds that forage in trees, right? So you probably maybe don't want to put like a grassland hedgerow on your edge. You maybe want to bring in oaks, or bigger trees into your hedgerow, because then you're going to attract woodpeckers and white-breasted nuthatches and all those things that actually eat stuff that's on trees. If that makes sense.
Mhm. Totally does.
Yeah.
Sacha, we have another question that came in. This person lives in walnut country and is wondering about predation rates when commercial walnut crops are so heavily sprayed. We do have a lot of woodpeckers and magpies around, and also hearing a lot about West Nile regarding the loss of our birds. Is there any knowledge on the impacts regarding these two issues?
Yeah, sure. So I actually did get to talk about this, but yeah, pesticides are a huge issue. And so this is why we are trying to, recommend that we try to utilize habitat whenever possible. I know often you cannot get rid of pesticides entirely if you're a conventional orchard, but having habitat on your orchard, I think we are demonstrating will actually reduce your need to spray as often. There has been a lot of research on spray effects on raptors in orchards, and definitely we know for a fact that pesticides harm birds. They remove their insect prey. They're damaging to individuals themselves. But in terms of it affecting the ability of the bird to predate on the codling moth larva, I looked actually, I worked in mostly conventional orchards. And so I actually looked at the amount that the growers put on their orchards the winter before, and to see if there was any relationship between the amount sprayed and both the natural codling moth densities and also the effects of the predation by the birds, and actually didn't find a strong relationship. So that's a really difficult one to measure. So we'll see. The second question is West Nile virus. Yeah, so West Nile virus especially impacts, as you pointed out, woodpeckers and corvids. So magpies, jays, those sorts of things have a lot of issues with West Nile. And if we're losing birds due to West Nile virus, we're going to see, their services. We're not going to see their services as much in the agricultural landscape. So, that issue is pretty much out of the control of a grower. Pesticides more in the control of a grower.